Great. Well, welcome and thank you so much for joining us on this Friday, the 7th of April, as a special guest. I've followed you for I was introduced to you for about 6 months ago, and I followed many of your videos. I've been very impressed, and I've learned a great deal on the philosophical side. I've been impressed with the way you deal with Hangouts, and this show here is probably a different audience. There's some people that follow you, like myself and a number of others. And a number of our viewers are Muslims, and I'm based in the UK in London. And I often go down to Speaker's Corner. I don't know if you're aware of that area.
I've heard of it, yes, and I've seen videos shot from that location.
Yes, that's right. So that's kind of very raw. Whatever happens in the moment happens. So there's some advantages, disadvantages, and so I'm always looking to learn. And so I've taken over the show for the last sort of 4 months. My co-host is on the road, and as I've mentioned, the show is really about, just as a broad topic, is how can atheism account for rationality? So I think before we start, particularly for a number of people who won't know who you are, I wonder if you could just give a brief sort of summary of, what your expertise are and why you're sort of involved in these sort of discussions.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm very honored to have been invited. My name is Ozymandias Ramses II. That's my YouTube handle. I'm a YouTuber with a YouTube channel. I also have a Facebook page by that same name. That username is a bit of a mouthful, so everyone just calls me Ozzy for short. My background is in contemporary analytic philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. I don't have a PhD in philosophy, although I was pursuing a PhD for a time before I left academia and started working in the private sector. And I had the privilege of teaching undergraduate students when I was a grad student myself. Though I left academia, I never lost my interest in philosophy. And so while I'm not a professional philosopher in any capacity, I guess I'm a lay philosopher, or an amateur philosopher, I guess is the best that one could say for me. But I had a religious upbringing myself. I was reared as more or less a Jehovah's Witness. And I sort of tumbled out of my faith in my middle to late teens. And at some point, I sort of moved from a very fundamentalist variety of Christian theism to a kind of deism and agnosticism, and back and forth a few times. And then finally, I came to the view that there's very likely no God, and now I self-identify as a provisional atheist. About 4 years ago or so, I became interested in participating in the great debate online on YouTube and on Google Plus and Facebook discussion groups and so forth. And I just sort of tossed my hat in the ring. I just started making content and participating in Hangouts and bringing to bear the knowledge I had of philosophy to primarily philosophical apologetics and counter-apologetics. I have some knowledge of science, but I don't have an educational background in the sciences. So when it came to scientific apologetics and counter-apologetics, I have no real expertise there. But I have some background in philosophy, and so that's what I brought to bear, and especially in connection with presuppositionalism. Presuppositionalism was sort of a hot new thing being discussed online within the great debate communities, and I sort of was very dissatisfied with the kinds of counter-apologetics that my fellow atheists were bringing to bear against people like Cy Ten Broek and Kate and that sort of thing. And so that's how I sort of made my my introduction to the great debate community, was by making videos and participating in Hangouts and discussions about presuppositional apologetics. And because my background, specifically my specialty, was in the philosophy of science and epistemology, I thought I had something that I could contribute meaningfully to that discourse. So that's how I made my way into this discussion, and it's been very gratifying. I've not been quite as active in the last year or so. I've sort of been pursuing other interests and hobbies of my that I have, but I seem to be getting back into it a little bit, despite myself.
That's wonderful, because I followed you, and I've obviously got subscribed to your channel, and I when you do a search, there's not a lot on your channel, but you do see the odd sort of hangout that you've participated in. But the last one I saw was, there was one last night or the night before, I think, but prior to that, I think it was 2016 was the last time that I could find a hangout of yourself.
Yeah, there's probably been a couple more recent than that, but yeah, I participated in a discussion on the New Covenant Group's channel 2 nights ago on the subject of faith and its relation to rationality. What I would argue is sort of the indispensability of faith. Seems a little bit counterintuitive to hear coming out of the mouth of a self-described skeptic and critical thinker and atheist. But if you watch that discussion, you'll see why I take the view that I do. But no, I've still been participating in discussions and hangouts. And if anyone's interested in my content and the discussions that I've been in, on my channel, you'll find the content that I've uploaded that are just sort of standard vlogging YouTube videos where one sort of opines and puts forward arguments. And so there you'll find me arguing against certain apologetic moves, but also you'll find me arguing against certain counter-apologetic moves. Very often I find that some of the arguments that my fellow atheists take in this discussion are not particularly good arguments, and I'd like to debunk some of those as well. But if you're interested in hangouts and discussions that I participated in, there is on my channel a playlist of over 100 hangouts that I have participated in. I didn't realize that I had participated in that many, but those are hangouts or online shows like this one, like the Magic Sandwich Show and so forth, that I participated in the last 4 years. So if you find that there's not enough content on my channel for your taste, there's a playlist there with plenty of me blabbing on other shows and in other people's hangouts.
Yes, I've downloaded quite a few. I've watched a number of them. There's probably still plenty to get through. So let's move on, if we can, to I don't know how much of the document that you managed to read, but I've taken some snippets, and I was very keen because over here in the UK, we're kind of behind, for want of a better word, than the US, particularly our theistic interlocutors, and I deal particularly mostly with Muslims in Speaker's Corner. There are Christians there, but I would suggest on any given Sunday, they probably outnumber everybody else. There's at least 70% Muslims, maybe 20% sort of Christians, and the rest non-believers or pantheists or whatever the case may be. And so obviously I get exposed more to that, so I'm not as well versed on the Christian arguments, although they're very similar from a broad perspective. But the Quranic arguments, for example, and the Muslim arguments are slightly different when you get into the Quran, but they borrow a lot from Christianity, and not very well from what I can see. But the particular text that I sent you was from, I would suspect, one of the sort of more intellectual Muslims that I'm aware of here in the UK. So I wanted to sort of get your thoughts as to whether you'd had a read of that, and if so, if not, I've got some text that I cut and paste from that I could perhaps ask your comments on.
Yeah, I did. That was a chapter from an Islamic apologetical work arguing against atheism. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the gentleman's name properly. It's Hamza Tzortis, is that correct?
That's right, yes. He actually did a debate with Lawrence Krauss. You might find a few other things. So he's used to doing debates, and he's a Muslim researcher and an apologist, yeah.
Yeah, I did read that chapter that you sent me. Found it interesting. There was plenty in it to object to, so I'm happy to answer any questions or address any points in it that you think are pertinent.
All right, great. So let's have a look at it. I've got it here. His basic premise is, and I'll sort of quote from him, we see our way, and he puts "see" in inverted commas, we see our way to a conclusion in our minds. Our minds take premises or statements and drive them, in inverted commas, to a mental destination. In other words, a logical conclusion. This is a key feature of a rational mind. Sort of comments or thoughts on that phrase.
Well, I mean that's an analogy or a metaphor, and it's true as far as it goes. I mean I think that adequately describes what we're doing when we're reasoning. What he seems to be getting at there is that when we are reasoning, we are not reasoning the way a digital computer reasons or a calculator reasons. That is, we are not blindly and unintelligently following laws of physics and chemistry there. We are intentionally trying to follow rules of inference. We are deliberately, consciously, purposively applying rules of inference to arrive at a conclusion. His metaphor is a little bit inaccurate in one respect. When you're driving, normally you're not just sort of following the road. You are following the road with a view to getting to a specific conclusion. And very often when we're reasoning, we don't know what conclusion we will arrive at. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we are trying to arrive at a conclusion, and we are reasoning and trying to confect arguments and cook up premises that will take us to a conclusion, to take us to our destination. That, I would argue, is not always the best and most open-minded form of reasoning, although we all do that. And so the driving metaphor analogy perhaps is not apt in that respect. It makes it sound like we're always trying to get to a specific conclusion when we're reasoning. And that, while that's true much of the time that's not true. Much of the time we are, in fact, just examining premises and applying valid rules of deductive inference or inductive inference to take us to a conclusion we know not where. So very often when we're reasoning, we don't know what the destination is. So perhaps it's more like kind of like going on a sightseeing tour. Sometimes when we're driving the car, we are really just seeing where the road will take us, as opposed to having a specific destination in mind. So that would be my thought on that analogy.
Great. We'll come back to it because he does sort of go into a little bit more as we go through the chapter. But then the next part to that is, he says, most forms of atheism imply philosophical naturalism, which demands that reason and everything else must only be explained via blind, non-rational physical processes. Now, I'm a methodological naturalist myself. I take it you may be. So I'm not too sure who he's aiming at and how many atheists would consider themselves philosophical naturalists. Perhaps you can tell people what that is and whether you agree with that statement.
Okay, well, yeah, I was a little puzzled when I read that, but I sort of understand the motivation. Certainly within the Great Debate, a lot of people who self-identify as atheists see themselves as science boosters, that is, promoters of science and the scientific worldview. They see themselves as enemies of dogmatism and superstition and religion specifically, and they have an allergy to the concept of the supernatural, and so they tend to be naturalists. They aren't just methodological naturalists in the sense that they think, well, you know, for the purposes of scientific investigation, we just have to proceed as if there is no supernatural, and we're not looking for supernatural explanations. We don't invoke any supernatural explanations. But a great many non-believers are actually committed implicitly to the view that there is no supernatural. You often hear atheists saying there's no such thing as the supernatural, and anything that we could discover, anything that science could reveal to us, would just be subsumed under the heading of natural. That's a very common argument. That's an argument I don't agree with, actually. But people who argue that way, I think, are, whether they call themselves methodological naturalists or philosophical naturalists, I think they are implicitly philosophical naturalists. And a philosophical naturalist, if someone's not familiar with that expression, is just someone who is of the view that all of reality is exhausted by the concept of the natural. That is, anything that is real is ultimately natural. It isn't supernatural. That's not to be confused with materialism or physicalism, which is the view that everything in reality is not just natural, but physical, or made out of matter. It's the view that, rather, philosophical naturalism is just the view that everything is non-supernatural or just natural. Now, that can get a little fuzzy, I think, because it's not always clear how to characterize what we mean by natural if we don't have a proper understanding of what the supernatural is, right? I mean, naturalism is supposed to be understood over and against this other concept, supernatural. And if we don't have a sort of well thought out view of what the supernatural is, that by implication means that the concept of natural is a little bit open and vague. But I mean, I think he's right insofar as he is of the view that most self-described atheists are metaphysical naturalists. And I think a lot of atheists play hide the ball with that and call themselves methodological naturalists when they are, in their heart of hearts, actually philosophical naturalists. They hold to the view that everything in reality is natural. There is no such thing as the supernatural. The supernatural is just either an incoherent notion, or there are just no instances of the supernatural at all. And so they would a priori, that is on philosophical grounds alone, just disregard any invocation of supernatural causes or entities or principles.
Okay, so would somebody like Aaron Ra be a philosophical naturalist as opposed to Matt Dillahunty, for example, because I know you know them and I follow them as well, who claims to be a methodological naturalist? Sorry, methodological. I've just lost the term now.
Naturalist, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Matt Dillahunty, he's the host of the Atheist Experience, for those who aren't familiar with him, but might know him through that medium. He self-identifies as a methodological naturalist. He is not committed to the view that there isn't and couldn't be anything supernatural. Although I think he and I differ on that, and we're about to have a conversation on that in coming weeks or months, actually. But someone like Aaron Ra, I believe, and I could be mistaken here, I'm a little bit trepidatious about putting words in his mouth, but I think he is of the view that there is only the natural, and that all of reality is exhausted by this concept of the natural, that there isn't and possibly even couldn't be anything supernatural. I could be wrong about that, though. So but I do think they differ on that. And I am myself not a metaphysical naturalist. I apply methodological naturalism in ordinary life, and I think the sciences are wise to do exactly that. But I'm not committed to the view that there isn't and couldn't be anything supernatural in existence. And I don't think Matt Dillahunty would disagree with that. So there you have at least two atheists who would sort of not fall under the heading of you're an atheist and therefore you're a philosophical naturalist. I mean, there's plenty of atheists who are not metaphysical naturalists, not committed to the view that all of reality is exhausted by the natural. I mean, I've known atheists who believe in souls. I've met people who don't believe in gods, in any god of any kind, but who nevertheless believe in principles like karma and metempsychosis or reincarnation. I've known atheists who believed in ghosts and things like that, and who hold seances and who believe in an afterlife. So you can be an atheist and believe in the supernatural, right? Not just sort of be sort of agnostic about it. I mean, I know that there are some atheists out there who are committed supernaturalists. They believe that reality includes certain supernatural entities and principles and causes and phenomena. So atheism doesn't imply naturalism, and naturalism doesn't imply atheism, curiously enough. You can be one without the other. And speaking for myself, I'm open to this concept of the supernatural. My own view is that I have yet to find a phenomenon that I think is best characterized as supernatural. That is, I don't find instances of anything that one can say, yes, this definitely should not be subsumed under the heading of the natural. And any time that there is a phenomenon that seems like, yeah, that would be really hard to reconcile with our naturalistic picture of scientific reality, invariably the phenomena in question kind of evaporates. When you look closely at it, it looks like it's a hoax or it's a misdescription or something like that. So I am of the view that so far as we can tell, everything in existence is natural. But I would not, on philosophical grounds, insist that there could not be a category of phenomena that is so different, ontologically speaking, from natural phenomena that it deserves a separate heading. I think that reality could, in principle, include phenomena that are so bizarre and so impossible to reconcile with natural phenomena, so different in character that they would deserve a different term, like supernatural or the paranormal or the super duper natural or whatever you want to call it. I'm open to a multiplicity of ontic or ontological categories, but I just so far have not found any phenomena that are genuinely paranormal, that are genuinely supernatural, or should be classed that way.
Okay, now that's a good sort of explanation for it. And I wonder if you could draw a distinction, if you can, between what you would class as supernatural versus the natural. If somebody asks you, well, okay, Ozzy, you're open to supernatural, could you in some way elucidate what that might be? Otherwise, you're open to something that can't really be explained.
Yeah, well, it's possible that supernatural phenomena, if they exist, are beyond explanation. That might just be. That could just be. It could just be that that if there are supernatural phenomena, they defy explanation. The difficulty with anyone who'd want to insist on that is that it might be the case that anything that is putatively put forward as supernatural might actually be a natural phenomenon that is as yet not properly understood, right? I don't have a definition of the supernatural. I leave it to the people who put forward the claim that there exist supernatural phenomena. I mean, I'm merely open to the possibility. I'm not claiming that there are supernatural phenomena. I leave it to the people who affirm that there are supernatural phenomena to give me instances of it, and then to give me reasons why these phenomena, if they exist, and they can be demonstrated to exist, deserve a different ontological category. So I actually don't walk around with a definition of supernatural. I mean, I don't see that it's my place to define the supernatural on behalf of other people who affirm that there is a supernatural. That is for them to do. I mean, there are different views on offer. For instance, very often it's tied to the concept of intentionality or mind. If, for instance, there was, for instance, a completely disembodied mind, right, like the mind of God, for instance, or something like that, I think that if such a thing existed, okay, such a system would not be subsumable under our existing concept of the natural, would not be subsumable under our existing concept of the physical or the material. We wouldn't know how to reconcile it with anything else in our scientific understanding. And I think that would be a genuinely, if that phenomenon could be demonstrated to exist, I think that would legitimately belong under a category of the supernatural. And a difficulty here is that someone like me, an atheist such as myself, can sometimes be challenged and say, well, listen, if you can't say what the supernatural is, then you're never going to be able to recognize it, and you're just going to sort of, de facto rule it out of existence. But again, I leave it to the people who affirm the existence of the supernatural to tell me what they mean by it, provide me with instances of it, examples of it, and some reason for why it shouldn't be subsumed under the category of the natural and deserves its own ontological category. That, I think, it behooves people who affirm the existence of the supernatural to do that work for us. They are, after all, the ones that are affirming this different ontological category. I don't have a definition of the supernatural. That to me is an open category. So I'll just leave it to them. I guess I don't have anything more to add on that.
No, sure, and I agree with you. And of course, as you say, sometimes we're approached, and theists will put it to us in some way that, or want to infer that we're somehow unreasonable because we don't know what a supernatural is, so how could we possibly accept it? So there's sometimes the case that they say, well, they put it across in some way, what would it take for you to believe? And in some way looking or inferring that, we're possibly unreasonable.
Yeah, well, that actually can be a good objection. Actually, I mean, if you're going to rule out the supernatural a priori, if you are a philosophical naturalist who doesn't just think, as a matter of fact, there is nothing supernatural, but there could be no supernatural. If you're the kind of person that says, look, no matter what we describe, no matter how bizarre, how weird, how different in character it is from everything else that we understand to be natural, that whatever we found would ultimately have to be subsumed under the heading of natural. That I think is a kind of question-begging move that no critical thinker should make. I think that when you make that move, you really are simply saying, by definition, anything that falls under the heading of reality falls under the heading of natural. That is natural and reality are coextensive sets. There's nothing that's in one set that's not in the other set. And I think that is question begging. And so when I am asked, what would convince you that the supernatural exists? Again, I would say, well, it depends what you mean by the supernatural. I don't walk around with a sort of handy-dandy definition of the supernatural is. All I know about the supernatural is it's supposed to be not the natural. In what respect does it differ? That's up for them to come up with. But if someone asked me, Ozzy, what would it take to convince you that God exists, like the God of the Bible, right? Like, Yahweh, from the Old Testament or something like that, right? Well, I mean, I have a test. People have heard me say this before, so I'm just going to repeat it. But here are some things that I think would attest to a supernatural character. If, for instance, a giant figure materialized on Earth, okay, you know, with the white beard and robes and whatever, like every stereotype, every cartoon of Yahweh on the throne appeared. And if when he appeared and he declared that he was the creator of the universe, and if to demonstrate that he is authentically the creator of the universe, that he is in fact Yahweh, all of the stars at night moved in the sky. They didn't just appear to. The astronomers look and they study this and they discover it. The stars have actually moved, and they spell out in every language, "I am that I am." All right, that famous line from the Old Testament, right? I think that would attest to a supernatural cause, since no known physical cause could do this, and it would coincide with this appearance of this magnificent being that declared himself to be the creator of the universe. And if you know physicists start looking down their electron microscopes and they see that every particle in existence is stamped with "made by Yahweh" on it, or something equivalent to that, I think that would be absolutely unmistakable evidence, right? And if at the same time something like everybody had a private, incommunicable, ineffable experience of having had a personal encounter or even hearing a voice or something like that from this being, and we all turned to one another and said, "I just had the most marvelous experience. I experienced this. I had a conversation with God." And the person next to you said, "Yeah, me too. And it went like this." And we all mutually, intersubjectively, were able to corroborate that we'd all had this experience. If people woke up, who were asleep when it happened, woke up and said, "I had this dream," and they related the same thing, I mean, that would be absolutely conclusive proof. I mean, the God of the Abrahamic faith would stand revealed as a science. We would all know then. We would have scientific proof. We would have personal individual experiences that were mutually corroborable. So now you might say, well, geez, that's awfully far-fetched. That's a lot to ask. Okay, well, that would do it anyway. Right? I would not be inclined, if that happened, to think maybe aliens with advanced technology came from another world and did this to us, messed with our minds through their superior technology. Is that also a possibility? Sure. Does that seem to be more plausible than Yahweh appearing? It's not more plausible to me than Yahweh appearing. I mean, if this wasn't evidence for the veracity of the Old Testament and the existence of this Yahweh figure, nothing would be. I think that would convince everybody. Everyone would. That's it. We would all be on our knees believing at that point. Now that seems like a very extreme example, but that's just to satisfy the condition. Look, yes, something would convince me. It would have to be fairly dramatic. It would have to be the kind of thing that I could not mistake for, wishful thinking, misreading my own experiences and emotions, misinterpreting events around me, reading too much into something, or trickery, or some kind of massive hoax or something like that. I mean, I would be more inclined to believe that than to think I was mad if everyone were to corroborate it, right? If that actually happened. So as far-fetched as that example seems, it just seems to me to be a perfect example of listen, if this, I think, would actually convince the world that one religion was true. And we would believe it. And that, I think, would be supernatural. I don't see how that phenomenon, or that set of phenomena that I just described, could be subsumed under the heading of natural. So no, I'm not someone who says anything that would happen, I would try to subsume it under the natural. I would try to imagine that it was a superior alien race with superior technology that was tricking me. I mean, anyone who argued that way, if this, what I just described, actually happened, you'd think that is better explained by aliens that we don't even know exist and stuff like that. I would say, okay, well, you really are a hidebound kind of person with a prejudice against the supernatural, right? I mean, let's be good empiricists here. This would be prima facie evidence of the supernatural, if anything was. And it probably wouldn't take anything that dramatic. Probably lesser things might do it, but I choose that extreme case because I think that would convince the world.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is setting the bar high, because I've been approached and I've said a sort of half of what you said, and the pushback against me has been, well, how do you know you're not dreaming? How do you know we're not having a mass hallucination? But the more conditions you add to it, the more, in fact, in a sense, it becomes reasonable for us to believe that. But if you just said, like I think Lawrence Krauss once said, oh, if I looked up at the stars and they realigned and said God is here, I'd believe it. But you've given extra criteria, because that could be an illusion. But with all those extra criteria, you you're more likely to believe it than not.
Yeah, yeah. Now, most theists would sort of, they sort of, when I have presented this to theists, they sort of balk. They say, well, listen, that's an unreasonable demand to place on God. Well, look, I'm not placing the demand. You are asking me what it would take to convince me. Well, this would suffice. Probably a lot less than that would suffice, but that surely would suffice. Okay? Don't fault me for telling you honestly what it would take to convince me, and I think this would sort of convince people on a planetary scale, but I mean that's not my fault, right? I mean, you're the one making the extravagant metaphysical claims, as I see it, of a being that is not only magnificently powerful but all powerful, and not only all powerful but omniscient, and knows everything that it would take to convince me. I mean, how such a being could fail to convince me is a little bit puzzling, given that such a being presumably wants to have its existence acknowledged, wants to be worshipped, and has the power to present evidence that would be absolutely persuasive. That wouldn't rob me of my free will to be persuaded on rational grounds by evidence that was absolutely conclusive. And this being omniscient would know exactly what it would take for every particular individual to convince that individual of his or her own existence. So, I mean, I don't see that that's a fault with my position, that the bar seems rather high. You know, just don't posit a being that's so magnificent and so grand, and then complain when I say, well, listen, you're positing something that seems metaphysically extravagant. I'm going to expect some evidence that is commensurate with the being that you're positing here. And that would do it on a planetary scale. On an individual scale, what it would take to convince me specifically, I don't know. But I would have to hear what you would propose as convincing evidence, and I will think about it. Yeah, would that be sufficient or not? But I don't have to walk around with some test for what would convince me of some cryptozoological creature, right? I mean, if you ask me, Ozzy, what would it take to convince you that Bigfoot exists? Well, as a matter of fact, that's a question I've thought about, and so I have an answer to that. But if I didn't have an answer to that because I hadn't thought about it, that wouldn't mean that I was a bigot about the prospect of Bigfoot and could never be convinced about the existence of Bigfoot, right? And if you ask me, what would it take to convince you of paranormal phenomena like telepathy and telekinesis and things like that, and precognition and clairvoyance and all of these phenomena? Well, I don't know. I haven't given it a lot of thought, right? But that doesn't mean for a moment that because I haven't worked out a principled answer to that question, that I cannot be convinced and that my mind is closed. I mean, that is simply a non sequitur. It simply doesn't follow that because I haven't thought through a test for a given far-fetched scenario, that I'm closed to the evidence should it present itself. Right? When the evidence presents itself, I will evaluate it, and only then will we be able to say, well, are you closed-minded or not? Should this evidence have convinced you or not? And then we can talk about it. But I don't have a responsibility to have a test for any proposed entity or cause or principle that you want to suggest exists, right? I mean, we'll take it on a case-by-case basis. And when it comes to the supernatural, what would it take to convince you of the supernatural? Look, that's pretty darn vague. That's like saying, what would it take you to convince that some species exists that is not known to exist? Well, I guess it would take a specimen of it, maybe, right? I can say that much, right? And that's what I would say about the supernatural. I would need an instance of the supernatural, whatever that is. And the problem is that in the case of an organism, convincing me of an organism, I have a sense of what an organism is, what an animal is, for instance, right? I know what critters are like. And so I could say, well, I just need to see a critter that, was different from all the existing critters, and then that would convince me. But in the case of the supernatural, it seems to me that we don't have in hand uncontroversial examples of it. The problem with the supernatural is this: I have never had a bias or prejudice against the supernatural. I mean, I started out believing in it, actually, as I grew up a believer. It's that I just don't have exemplars of it. I don't have instances of it where I can look and say, okay, this is an instance of the supernatural. This is an instance of the supernatural. Look at what they have in common. This is what characterizes the supernatural. This is how it differs from the natural. This is how we can identify, in general, based on analysis of these sorts of cases, what is supernatural and what is natural. That's the difficulty that I have with it. But that seems to me that this is work that needs to be done by the proponents of the supernatural. It shouldn't behoove the people who are simply unconvinced of the existence of the supernatural and find it a dubious concept to come up with criteria. I mean, supposing I come up with a criterion, a general criterion of the supernatural, and another person comes along and is asked the same question, you know, how would you identify the supernatural? What would it take to convince you of the supernatural? That person is probably going to come up with a different test, right? Because they're going to have some other idea of what the supernatural might be in hand, right? Mm-hmm. Look, it is simply up to the people who are putting forward what the supernatural is to tell us what it is and how they identify it. What tests can we apply? What criteria can we apply that allow us to distinguish genuine instances of supernatural phenomena and that it entails why we should classify it differently than natural phenomena and not subsume it under the natural. So that's the problem I have with this.
Great answer. Okay, so let's pivot back to part of Hamza Tzortis's chapter here. And the next part he talks about physical processes that are blind can never drive, in inverted commas, any premises in our minds to a mental destination. Therefore, atheism is in effect equivalent to rejecting reason itself because it invalidates its own assumption. Our ability to reason simply does not fit within the naturalistic worldview because rationality cannot come from blind, non-rational physical processes. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that seems to be completely question begging. The assertion that brute blind physical processes could not generate systems, you know, systems like us with brains that are capable of rationality. That's unargued. I mean, he's simply asserted no, that any system that is comprised entirely of the physical couldn't do this. Well, that's what's at issue. I'd like to hear what the argument for that is. No argument has been given for this. I think this is one of those things where it just strikes him as so obvious that rationality is a mental phenomenon, and mental phenomena, in his view, are not reducible to the physical, that therefore the physical cannot account for rationality. I think that he's got sort of the argument backwards there. He's not someone who thinks the mind is sort of not reducible to the physical because rationality isn't reducible to the physical or cannot result from the physical. But I think it's rather the case that he is of the view that generally that mental phenomena are not reducible to the physical, cannot be exhaustively accounted for in terms of the physical, therefore cannot be ultimately physical, and therefore rationality, being a mental phenomena, also cannot be reducible or accounted for in terms of the physical. So I think there what he's got there is really just an assertion that's not properly argued for. And I mean, he makes that assertion repeatedly, and he just rephrases it many, many different ways throughout that chapter. But nowhere do I find the argument for that. I mean, I just find that unconvincing. Well, first of all, I mean, just prima facie, it seems to me, look, we are physical beings, and we are physical beings that have a mental life. And we don't seem to find beings that have a mental life where there are where they don't have some physical presence. I mean, as far as we know, everything that has a mind also has a body and has a brain. So I mean, right there, prima facie, inductively, there seems to be good inductive evidence to suspect that the two go hand in hand. So right on its face, I think that the assertion is suspicious. But just on a casual glance at the evidence, it seems to me that brains cause minds. We don't have the account of that. We don't understand how it works. Well, that's okay. We don't understand how it works. Well, we don't know, and we might never know. But that it doesn't follow that because we don't know how to reduce one phenomenon to another phenomenon, that that one isn't caused by the other. Now, I think it's prejudicial to insist that brains cause minds, and that it can't be any other way, right? That it has to be monism, and it has to be some kind of physicalism or materialism that is the truth of the story here. I think that's prejudicial. I don't prejudge that question of the mind-body problem. I'm rather open on that. I'm not a dualist. I am a monist, but I'm not a sort of physicalist monist. I'm what's called I subscribe to something called neutral monism. I think that our existing concept of the physical, as we understand it, is currently not adequate to explain all of the mental phenomena such as rationality, subjectivity, intentionality, and so forth. I mean, these are mental phenomena. These are qualities of mental phenomena that we don't know how to reduce to physical phenomena, and we might never be able to reduce them. And I suspect that the reason we can't do it is our understanding of the physical is just not rich enough. And maybe someday we will be able to do it, and maybe not. So I don't prejudge the question of the mind-body problem. I don't sort of fall down hard on one side in terms of physicalism, although I'm more inclined to think that that's true than some kind of idealism, for instance. And I think it's more likely to be true than some kind of dualism, because dualism entails all kinds of problems of its own. How do mind and matter interact if they are two different substances or two different kinds of properties? Whether you're a property dualist or a substance dualist, there are interaction problems that arise. So I think that Hamza's claim here, I think, is very much underdetermined by the evidence. I think the evidence actually, just on a surface look, points in the other direction, and he hasn't made an argument for the claim that mental phenomena cannot be reduced to physical phenomena, or that rationality itself specifically cannot be accounted for in terms of the other. And it simply doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur to say we don't have an account how this can be explained in terms of that. Therefore, they're unrelated somehow. That is just a simple non sequitur. So that I don't think is a very persuasive argument.
Yeah, he definitely seems to suggest that because atheism, in inverted commas, doesn't have a current explanation, even if it's not reductionism. I think there's a couple of views on reductionism, but even if we don't have that explanation, he's got an account, and he dismisses the fact that we can't have or don't yet have a full explanation, and the fact that he claims to have one as an argument.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there when you use the expression he claims to have an argument. He claims to have an account. I don't know what his account is. He hasn't provided it. I mean, his account seems to consist of there exists a being other than us that isn't physical, that has a mind and is able to exercise rationality. Well, that's that's a lot of grandiose claims there, but that's not an account. I mean, so what if there was a being that was disembodied, that had a mind and could exercise rationality? That wouldn't establish that human rationality isn't exhaustively accountable for ultimately in terms of neural processes. And he just doesn't have an account. He's just saying, look, my God has rationality. So what? Okay, so even if your God, even if that were true, that wouldn't be an account of rationality. That just leaves rationality even more mysterious. Wow, now it turns out that something embodied and something disembodied can exercise rationality. That's not an account. You just compounded the mystery here. So I don't see how anyone can think that they have sort of scored a point against atheism here. And I mean, it's perhaps worth mentioning that it is not the responsibility of atheism to account for anything. I mean, atheism is the view that gods don't exist, and that is not an entire metaphysical picture of reality. That is not the claim that everything in reality is natural. That is not the claim that everything in the natural world is ultimately physical, and that all phenomena that we find are reducible to the physical. Right? None of those claims that I just described are atheism. Atheism is the view that probably there's no God, or definitely there's no God. It's the rejection of theism. Okay, that's what atheism is. It's not physicalism. So really, what he's trying hard to do here is counting on the fact that very many atheists are metaphysical naturalists and physicalists, and he thinks if he can say, look, there are important phenomena such as rationality that are not accounted for within naturalism and physicalism, Therefore, atheism is false. I mean, it just doesn't follow that that's true. And let's just say that there isn't an account. Let's just imagine this. Let's just imagine that physicalism and metaphysical naturalism cannot, not do not, but cannot account for the phenomenon of rationality. Let's say that that's true. Okay. Does it follow that there is no God? It simply does not follow, right? And now supposing you say, yes, but I could account for this phenomenon if there's a God, but you'd have to show that that is the correct account, right? The fact that a certain system doesn't account for something doesn't mean that theory is false, right? I mean, yeah. the theory of gravity doesn't account for rationality. That doesn't mean that the theory of gravity is false, right? This is a kind of guilt by association game that he's playing here. But what's worse is that his own view isn't an account. I mean, unless he has such a degenerate view of what an account is, namely to say, my God created rationality, my God has rationality and created rationality, that's my account. Well, look, I mean, that's a really vacuous account. I mean, if you're intellectually satisfied with that as an account, I would say that you're just a little bit too intellectually easily satisfied. So, I mean, that would be my objection to that. I mean, one simply has nothing to do with the other. The fact that you can or cannot account for something doesn't mean that a certain theory is true. And it certainly doesn't imply that atheism is false, since atheism doesn't say anything about rationality. It's not a claim about rationality any more than it's a claim about gravity or a claim about plumbing, right? It's just utterly irrelevant. So what he's trying to do is this game of guilt by association. Most atheists, as he sees it, are metaphysical naturalists and physicalists. Metaphysical naturalism and physicalism do not, and perhaps cannot, account for the phenomenon of rationality. Therefore, that picture of reality has to be false. Well, it might be true as far as it goes, and it so happens that something else within that person's philosophical outlook could account for it. It's just that physicalism and naturalism don't. But certainly it has no bearing on atheism whatsoever. So I don't see that he's scored any advantages there.
Yes, agreed. In fact, he says it in the sort of next he doesn't say that, but he says kind of what you said, which is he asserts it with the following: our ability to form mental insights fits within the Islamic theism because this ability makes sense, i.e., it is explained adequately. If it was given to us by the Creator, who is all-seeing, the knowing, the wise.
Yeah. Now, if that constitutes an adequate account, I don't see how it does. I mean, that really just is an assertion. That is simply not an explanation. That has not demystified how rationality exists in the world. That is simply the assertion that there exists something that has the property that we're trying to understand, and that thing imputed or is responsible for this thing in the world. So, there exists an X such that X has rationality, and X has somehow infused rationality into the world or into us. This is your explanation? There exists a thing that I stipulated has a certain property, the very property we're trying to understand? Look, you can't explain rationality. You can't explain logic. You can't explain the concept of truth or beauty or morality or any of this by simply saying, I stipulate that there exists a thing that has this property and that this thing is responsible for its existence in our world. That's just not an explanation. I could explain anything that way. That is an absolutely fatuous and vacuous explanation. It contributes nothing to our understanding. All you've done is you said, look, something like rationality or goodness or something, whatever property that you're interested in, is mysterious, and we want to understand how it works in the world. I'm just going to take that and I'm going to apply it to my God and say that's a property of my God. Well, all you've done is told me something about your God. You haven't told me anything about goodness. You haven't told me anything about rationality or logic. You haven't. The arrow of explanation goes the other way. If anything, you've helped me understand what you mean by your God. My God is rational. Okay, I understand something now about your God to the extent that I understand something about rationality already, but you have not augmented my understanding of rationality. Right? To say of God that he is rational, that he has a rational and ordered mind, doesn't tell me, it tells me something about your God, right? As opposed to him being irrational, right? Or non-rational, but it tells me nothing about rationality. I'm no better off in my appreciation for what rationality is and how it comes to be in the world by you saying that some other entity exhibits this quality and somehow inexplicably is responsible for that quality existing in the world and in us. That is just not an explanation. That is simply compounding the mystery with another mystery, a very metaphysically extravagant mystery at that.
Yes, I agree. And what he will attempt to do, and I'm sure you will have something to say on this, is to then bring in Quranic verses, and I'll read you a couple which he thinks in some way backs this up. So here's a couple of Quranic verses. God says, "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within their own selves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. But it is not sufficient concerning your Lord that he is over all things a witness?" Question mark. And then another verse is, "Then do they not reflect upon the Qur'an, or are there locks upon their hearts? So will you not reason?" So presumably these are some Quranic verses that in some way he wants to justify why Islamic theism can account for rationality.
Well, I'm really not qualified to comment on his exegesis of the Quran. I have read the Quran in a couple of translations, but I mean, I confess that it is a very obscure work to me, and I don't see how those passages really connect up with any proper notion of an account of how rationality is possible. So I really don't want to say much more about that. I don't see how those verses actually substantiate his claim. That just seems
Sure.
kind of a weird and weak associative induction to my mind.
Yes, and of course I get presented with these sort of verses in Speaker's Corner regularly as well, and to me they're just so vague they could mean anything, and often when you read them in context, he's presumably Allah is giving a message to either Muhammad or to Muslims in general, and then there's these sort of little things that are put in there that almost look metaphorical, and then they are picked out to shore up or to back up some other claim that oftentimes doesn't seem to have anything to do with the bigger picture. I wanted to move on with something else that he said here that I thought was interesting. He said, "The human practice of science rests on the assumption that we can reason. This means that the existence of reason cannot be fully accounted for by any type of scientific explanation. This does not mean that science cannot provide any partial explanation for all of our ability to reason. However, it is unable to justify reason from a foundational point of view."
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he was getting at there, except perhaps some kind of allegation of begging the question. I mean, science certainly does presuppose that we can reason, because science isn't just observation. It is making inferences and arriving at conclusions based on those inferences, based on those observations. I mean, science isn't just some passive, you just look and see and suddenly your mind is filled with beliefs. It is a sort of a systematic practice of observation and data collection and hypothesis testing. You don't just, collect data. You're not just counting butterflies and recording their colors or anything like that. You're in fact making predictions about what you will find next, and trying to identify and isolate causes and effects and things like that. So there's all kinds of reasoning that goes on. There's all kinds of induction, deduction, and abduction that's used in science. So clearly, science, just like working your way through life on an everyday basis, presupposes that we have reason and can reason. So that's certainly true. And I guess what he's getting at here, though, is if you want an account of rationality, well, how are you going to proceed? Well, presumably you're going to use reason. Presumably you're going to use science. You're going to make observations and draw scientific inferences and stuff like that. And so you will have to rely on your reason in the act of coming up with an account, a scientific picture or a scientific account of how rationality came about. And I guess he sees some kind of question-begging circularity there. And I think that's true. I mean, that's right as far as it goes. It's true. We are going to have to use rationality to understand how rationality came into the world. I mean, presumably, I mean, if our existing scientific picture of reality is correct, there was a time when there was a planet here and there were no living organisms on it. There were no minds. And so there wasn't any rationality being exhibited by anything. They were just brute, blind physical processes. But at some point in the evolutionary picture, organisms arise that aren't just plants and fixed and don't need minds and don't need, you know, there were organisms that were mobile, that could be carried about, you know, by, you know, forces like, you know, water movement and stuff like that from one environment to the other, and that they could sort of exercise some degree of control over, you know, where they ended up and what they could do. They could, you know, avoid dangers and seek out nutrients and things like that, right? At some point, you need some kind of control or guidance system, right? And natural selection has provided a kind of guidance system. And therefore, organisms have to be able to discriminate between things that are conducive to survival and things that are, you know, deleterious and damaging and harmful to their survival and reproductive success. And so minds seem to come about as basically guidance systems, the ability to discriminate, to have experiences that allow you to track reality, to see what's changing around you. Am I in a dangerous environment? Am I near food? Is there a predator? Do I need to run? Do I need to move forward? Is that a mate? You know, all of that. At some point, those mind enters the picture in the evolutionary story, and some kind of inferential practice at some point comes to be established. Now, any account that we give about how behavioral self-control arises, how mental experiences are possible through brains and are the sensitive to changing states of affairs around us. Any account of how we are able to extrapolate from present experiences, connect them with prior experiences that we have in memory, and extrapolate and make predictions about what we will experience next and what we ought to do next and how we ought to control our bodies to navigate into the world, right? This is going to be a scientific account of the evolution of how rationality arrives in the evolutionary record, right? I mean, it's not there at the beginning. It's not there in, you know, blue-green algae, but it's there later on. And increasingly over time, we get smarter and smarter creatures within certain sublineages. So there's going to be presumably a scientific account, but of course that account is going to have to be delivered by a creature that has a mind and is using rationality to generate that account. Right? So that's absolutely true. We're going to be using our ability to reason and make inferences and use rationality in our account of rationality. But why is that a problem exactly? Like, I mean, we use rationality to arrive at other conclusions. Why, and make other discoveries. Why can't we use rationality? I mean, if rationality works, if it's fine, what's wrong with providing an account of how rationality came into the picture here on Earth and in our own history using rationality? Right? Well, it's not like there's anything else to use, but what is it about the fact that we are exercising our rationality to understand rationality, right? Its evolution, its strengths, its capacities, its limitations, its failures, right? What is wrong with using rationality to arrive at an understanding of rationality? I mean, is there something wrong with using our mind to understand the mind? Is there something wrong with relying on our memories to study human memory, how well it works, when it works, under what circumstances can we trust our memories, under what circumstances are mnemonic failures more likely than others and stuff like that? Is there some kind of problem that blocks us from doing? No. This is not the damning sort of indictment that he seems to think it is. I see no bar to using rationality to understand rationality than I see in understanding rationality to understand anything else. You know, is there a circularity involved there? Of course, but I don't see how it invalidates anything.
Well, I think that's the point, is they seem to presume that it's circular and therefore it invalidates itself, but they have a non-circular explanation, which is simply God presumably somehow gave us rationality. How that works and what demonstration there is, as you say, there's nothing forthcoming, but it's just an assertion based on the fact that they can do that and it sounds reasonable and we don't have an account for it.
Well, but any assessment of the reasonableness of his own account will have been arrived at using his own rationality.
Correct.
Which is exactly the same problem. I mean, like we are always all in the same boat on this, right? None of us, positing a God doesn't sort of get you out of this kind of quandary that we find ourselves in. Oh, can we study the mind? Can we use the mind to study the mind? Can we use rationality to understand rationality? Look, is his account rational or not? If he thinks it's rational, presumably he used reason. Presumably he assumed the reliability of his own inferential practices in evaluating his theory that his God accounts for rationality. That's exactly the problem that he was alleging. I mean, positing a God doesn't get you out of that problem. All you've done now is you've just added this extravagant metaphysical posit in the middle of your explanation, or actually at the outset of your explanation, but it doesn't change anything. It's not like he didn't have to exercise his rationality in evaluating the rationality of his account. Presumably he did. But if it's wrong for an atheist to do that, or if it's wrong for a non-theistic account of rationality to do that, it's going to be wrong in a theistic account, because the sin here, the wrongdoing that he's alleging, is the use of rationality in one's understanding of rationality. But that's not something that he has avoided doing. I submit to you that he didn't fail to use his mind in coming up with his account of rationality in terms of Allah. I submit that he did exercise his rationality in that account. And therefore, he is subject to the same charge that he's trying to level at other people. And I just think it's a fatuous charge. What else should we be using?
Yes, agreed. I think they just seem to see the connection between God infusing rationality into them as getting out of that circularity. He's just infused it, therefore we've got it so we can think about it. They don't see that as circular for some reason. He had a few objections at the end of the passage, as you may have come across. And one of them was rationality can arise out of complexity. So this is obviously what he feels an atheist would put forward. And he basically says, emergent materialists argue that a system of complex physical processes undergoing complex interactions can give rise to properties or phenomena that do not exist in the individual components that comprise the system. The emergent materialist will cite the history of science, etc. And he goes on and he talks about H2O. Water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, which are gases, yet when combined chemically, they form the life-sustaining liquid. Water has properties that hydrogen and oxygen do not. Examples like these provide the emergent materialist with the confidence to argue that a property can arise from a system of complex processes, even though it's not present in the components of that system. Nevertheless, this example is misplaced because the argument articulated in this chapter is not a case of a physical thing bringing into existence another physical thing. What would be your thought on that? So he's dismissing emergent materialism as an objection.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, that last statement that he makes there, it utterly begs the question. But let's look at the example. It's actually a good example. I think it's actually an important point. It's often pointed out that physical causes or a physical system can lack certain properties, but through some kind of complex interaction with something else, another mere physical process, can engender properties that you would not have predicted were there, were not obvious, just from looking at what you start out looking at initially. So let's look at water. Water is comprised of H2O, and water has interesting features, right? I mean, at certain temperatures it's solid, at other temperatures it's liquid, at other temperatures it's gaseous. So I mean, water, think of the liquidity of water. The liquid feature of water is a real property. It's not an illusion or an epiphenomenon, right? Liquidity is a real feature. If the liquidity of water wasn't real, right? I mean, I couldn't drink this tea. I couldn't drink it. I couldn't pour it. You couldn't bathe in a lake or in a bathtub. Okay, so I mean, those are real features. They're not illusory or epiphenomenal. Nevertheless, I can't reach into this mug and pull out an H2O molecule and say, oh, this one's wet, you know. And that's because an individual H2O molecule is not itself wet. H2O molecules aren't busily secreting some juice or substance or anything like that. And the H2O molecule is not only is an individual H2O molecule itself not wet, but the components of H2O, the hydrogen and oxygen atoms, are themselves not wet and don't have the feature of liquidity. So hydrogen and oxygen atoms by themselves do not exhibit the property of liquidity. An H2O molecule by itself, even a bunch of H2O molecules by themselves, don't exhibit liquidity. But if you get enough of them at the right temperature, bashing into each other in the right ways, at a gross level of description, at a higher level of description, there is, in fact, this property, liquidity, that is not present at the lower level of description. Okay, so this is a kind of physical reduction here that physics and chemistry has achieved. It is physics and chemistry have achieved the ability to explain the liquid feature of water that we see at this gross surface level in terms of microelements. And the microelements don't themselves possess those features, right? So hydrogen and oxygen atoms are not liquid. Individual H2O molecules are not liquid. Nevertheless, the whole system in aggregate, interacting in complex ways, do generate a feature that is not present at the lower level. And the reason this is important is that people in the philosophy of mind, especially people committed to some kind of monistic materialism or physicalism about the mind, will insist, well, that's how we can understand the relationship between mind and body. We don't understand how the oatmeal textured stuff between my ears, right, the neural activity going on in my ears, we don't understand, between my ears rather, we don't understand how to account for phenomena like rationality, subjectivity, intentionality, the will and so forth. We don't know how to account for that in terms of neural effects yet, right? And perhaps we won't anytime soon. We'll be able to correlate certain neural events with certain mental events, but we don't know why, when the neurons are firing a certain way, I have the experience of redness as opposed to the experience of blueness. We just know that under these circumstances I experience redness, and under those circumstances I experience blueness. But why is the wine red as opposed to green or something like that when I look at it? So there are all these questions that remain when you look at the physical. I mean, we are getting pretty good at a detailed microanatomy of our neurophysiology, and yet it's unclear why these neural events produce these mental phenomena, or any mental phenomena at all. I mean, the mind-body problem really is a mystery. We still don't have an answer to that, and I don't know if we ever will have an answer to that. But one of the suggestions is that, look, the way to understand the relationship of the mind to the body is to characterize it in terms analogous to the H2O and liquidity example, right? The mind is just some consequence of a complex interaction of brute physical processes, and it's not apparent how one produces the other, but it is a result of this complex interaction. And the analogy works the same way. We will eventually come to understand why mental events and why specific mental events result from certain neurophysiological events, just as we have come to understand how liquidity arises from the complex interactions of H2O molecules. Right. Now, that's a bit of a blank check. That means maybe we will and maybe we won't. And so I think he's right in his objection that, look, that's a bit of a facile answer. Like, maybe that story is true. I would argue. He would say it's not true, but maybe that story is true. But certainly it's not a foregone conclusion. We certainly can't rest and say, well, definitely some such story is true. Definitely we will be able to reduce mental phenomena to purely physical phenomena. Okay, so he's sort of trying to suggest there that is just a little bit too quick and dirty an account of the relationship of the mind to the brain. That's just, that analogy simply isn't on. Now, one of the reasons he gives, though, at the very, very end is, could you read that last sentence to me again, please?
Let's just have a look here for you. I'll just read this little bit, and I'm sure it's in here. Where are we? I'm just looking through it. Complex process. I'll just read it from the top, and then just tell me when to stop, and I'll stop there.
Okay. It was almost the last. It was pretty near the last sentence that you read.
After the water part.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
That was the question-begging part.
Examples like these provide the emergent materialist with the confidence to argue that a property can arise from a system of complex processes, even though it is not present in the components of that system. Nevertheless, this example is misplaced because the argument articulated in this chapter is not a case of a physical thing bringing into existence another physical thing, like gases, etc.
That's it. Okay, that's it. So what he's saying there is that in the case of the relationship of the mind to the body, what we've got is a mental phenomena and a physical phenomena. And in the case of the H2O and water analogies, what we have is a physical phenomena and another physical phenomena. So that in that case, we can explain one in terms of the other because they're both physical. Oh, so what he's saying is, but that doesn't work. That analogy can't work in this instance. Now, I agree that the analogy is a bit facile. It's a bit too easy. I mean, the case has not been established that the relationship of the mind to the body is analogous to the liquidity to the H2O molecules. But his reason is actually a very bad one. His reason is completely question-begging. His reason is the mental can't be a product of the physical because these are two different kinds of things. Whereas in the case of H2O and liquidity, those are both physical phenomena. In the case of the mind and the body, we have a physical phenomena and a mental phenomena. How could a physical phenomena produce a mental phenomena? Well, I agree. We don't know how a physical phenomena produces a mental phenomena. But to suggest that they can't be, right, which is what he's saying, is to beg the question. It's to beg the question against materialism. What he's saying is, look, you can't account for the mental in terms of the physical. I'm sorry, what was the argument again? Your argument is that this kind of analogy can't work because the physical can't account for the mental. I thought you were going to give an argument for that. But it turns out that his reason for why this is a bad analogy is that the physical can't account for the mental. I thought you were going to give me a reason why the physical couldn't account for the mental. But it turns out that your reason for why this is a bad analogy is that I'm just declaring that the physical can't account for the mental. That's not an argument. So he hasn't actually made an argument here. I mean, there are all kinds of positions with respect to the mind-body problem. There are eliminative materialists who think that we just need to stop talking using this idiom of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, desires, and all this intentionalistic vocabulary, and eventually we can just understand, mental phenomena in terms of purely brute descriptions of neural events. You won't say, "Ow, I'm in pain." You'll just say, "My C fibers are firing," or something like that. And they think that ultimately all talk of mental events is just a confused ontology. It's just a way of talking. It's like talking about sunrises and sunsets. The sun doesn't literally rise and set. It's just a way of talking that we still talk that way, but we know that really the sun doesn't rise and set. Right? The Earth is rotating, and it's an illusion, but it's not actually happening that way. And then you have other people who say, well, no, mental phenomena are real, they're genuine, they're ineliminable. We're not going to be able to eliminate the mental, but nevertheless, the mental can be exhaustively accounted for in terms of the physical. It's just that we don't have that explanation yet, right? And then you have idealists who think that ultimately the physical is a manifestation of the mental, that ultimately all of reality is mind-like, and then you have dualists who believe that no, and I think this gentleman is a dualist in a very strong form. He believes that mental and physical are two different kinds of realms, and one isn't a product of the other, and so one cannot be explained in terms of the other. Well, that might be true, right? Maybe that's true. Maybe dualism of that form is true. But if that is true, that's not an argument for the truth of dualism. That's just the statement of dualism. So when he says, look, this analogy is no good, right? This sort of promissory note that we will eventually be able to account for one or the other is no good because the mental can't be a product of the physical because the physical can't account for the mental. Look, that's what's at issue. you can't just state that as a fact and then say I've refuted this kind of materialism or physicalism, right? This kind of monism, physicalist monism. That's actually not an argument, right? All he's done there is reassert his conviction that the mental is so different from the physical that it isn't a result of that the mental isn't a result of the physical, and so cannot be accounted for it. But I think he sort of tips his hand there in that last sentence when he says that there's a disanalogy. In one case with the analogy with H2O and water, you have two physical phenomena, one physical phenomenon accounting for another physical phenomena. But in the case of the mind-body problem, you have a physical thing causing a mental thing. But what a physicalist or a monist is saying is precisely that the mental thing really is ultimately physical, right? It just superficially looks different. But a proper understanding of the phenomenon would reveal that it is ultimately physical. And so he's begging the question against the physicalist. Now, I agree that the physicalist case hasn't been made just by using that analogy. I think it's actually a fairly promising analogy, and I think there are actually disanalogies that in that example that could be legitimately raised. But this particular one is not a good one. It's a completely question-begging one.
Okay, good. So from your point of view, is there any explanation that we could give as atheists that would have some kind of an answer to rationality? Or are we currently in a position, as far as you can see, where we don't have any answer? And I agree with you, that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't an answer that we could provide or that he's got an answer. But from your point of view, what could we say as a response to this?
Oh, well, there's a lot of things that we can say. The problem is, I was actually trying to formulate a succinct way of doing this, and there's no succinct way of doing this because nowhere in that chapter, he might do it elsewhere in the book, but in that chapter, he doesn't really get at what rationality is. I mean, what he seems to mean by rationality is simply applying inference rules. Okay, sort of conformity with certain principles of deduction and induction, and that's fine as far as it goes. But that's not an account of like why logic is true, for instance, right? Like, why is logic true, right? Or why is induction valid? I mean, there are all kinds of theories about why logic would be true. Why is the world logical? Why does I mean, there are sort of various theories of logic about why logic obtains and what logic consists of, right? Is it merely nominal? Is it a conceptual thing? Must one posit some kind of Platonic relationships or something like that? And there's various theories about that. And then with respect to induction, you can ask, well, what makes induction true? What makes induction valid? Well, one of the things that would make induction valid is if, in fact, we live in a world of ordered regularities, where there exist regularities across time that will continue to hold in the future, such that the future will resemble the past. And if that's true, then induction holds and we can apply induction. He doesn't seem to be in this chapter arguing for the need or the necessity for an account of those things. What he seems to be asking for is, how could it be that there could be beings that are able to think, period, and that are able to think in conformity with certain inference rules in order to arrive at certain conclusions? But that doesn't seem to me to be particularly mysterious. I sort of outlined this, the start of an account of rationality. I mean, if you just imagine, I mean, okay, let's start with plants. I mean, why don't plants have minds? Why are we not sort of worried when you're mowing the lawn? Oh my goodness, I'm hurting my plants. What if they're suffering and stuff like that? Why don't we think that blades of grass are suffering when you cut them? And that the potatoes are like, in outrage at being murdered when you uproot them or something like that. Like, why? Why do we not think that, right? Well, the reason we don't think that plants don't have mental lives is that there's no evidence that plants have mental lives. But there's also a good biological reason for thinking that plants don't have mental lives and can't reason. And that is that plants are rooted. They're immobile. They don't pursue prey. They don't avoid prey. They just grow. I mean, even something like a Venus flytrap that can capture prey does so through a kind of like a mousetrap mechanism almost. It's absolute. There's no It isn't actively doing anything. There's no behavioral plasticity there. So plants don't have any behavioral plasticity. They don't have any need for behavioral plasticity. They're rooted. They extract what they need in the way of nutrients from the soil, in the ground, from water in the ground, and from sunlight, and photosynthesize. They don't need minds. That's why they don't feel pain. And that's why they don't have beliefs and desires and memories. Those would all be redundant. Natural cell organisms, plants don't need a neurophysiology, and so couldn't evolve one. But anything that's motile, anything that can move around, right? Even primitive bacteria needs a guidance control system. Now, the more the system becomes behaviorally complex, the more the system has an enriched behavioral repertoire, the more it's important for that system to recognize the circumstances in which it finds itself. The more the system requires a way of having within itself a way of reflecting what's going on outside, so that it can make discriminations. A system eventually becomes behaviorally rich and complex enough that there has to be a system, a guidance control system within it that allows it to discriminate. It's dark outside, it's bright outside, there's a looming shadow over me, it's probably a predator or something like that. Or these nutrients are good, and those things over there, those chemicals, those are not nutritious, stay away from those, right? And eventually you get systems that have neurophysiologies that allow them to behave appropriately relative to the circumstances that they find themselves in, okay? These neurophysiological systems over time within certain sublineages become more and more complicated, allowing the system to exhibit greater and greater behavioral richness and plasticity to exploit the circumstances that they find themselves in, right? So eventually you get systems that are able to represent what's going on around them, right? I mean, if you think about what perception is, what is visual perception? When I look over here and I see my hand, what's happening here is I don't just see my hand, I also immediately form the belief that there's a hand there. When I look over here to my right and I see my hand, I am immediately filled with a belief. It's completely implicit. I don't even have to think of it consciously, that this is a human hand over here. It's my hand, as a matter of fact, right? A visual system, an olfactory system, a tactile system, all of these sensory systems, this apparatus that we have, they are tracking systems. They are systems that allow us to have mental states that change constantly and are being updated, that co-vary with what's going on around us, right? So I feel temperature changes around me, and I have visual experiences that change in accordance with what is visually happening around me. And so so that's how I think mind comes into it. Now, the specifics about how mental experiences are generated, we don't know. That's still a mystery. But it's not a mystery why a system has to be able to make discriminations between itself and what's not it. Right? Organisms mustn't eat themselves. They mustn't consume themselves. So they immediately have to be able to make discriminations between self and non-self. They have to be able to make discriminations between what is useful and what is not useful, what is dangerous and what is advantageous. They have to be able to remember, or it's advantageous to them. They don't have to, but it's advantageous to them over their conspecifics, over the other species around them, members of their own species specifically. It is advantageous to them if they can recall, or even just have a disposition to behave differently based on what's happened in the past, right? This is what we call learning. Learning, what is learning? Learning is, above all else, recalling, either consciously or just pickled into your bones, recalling what happened before and learning from experience, right? Extrapolating from that experience, assuming, as we all do, that the future will resemble the past in relevant respects. My dog uses induction. My dog doesn't think, there's a black swan, there's a black swan, there's another black swan, all swans are black. Right? My dog doesn't do induction that way. But my dog does remember that the food was in that dish over there, and that it was there first thing in the morning, and that the day before that, there was food in the dish, and the day before that, there was food in the dish in the morning, and so forth. So that at a certain time of day, when my dog gets up, it immediately runs to the food bowl, expecting there to be food. right? That's induction. My dog does induction. It just doesn't consciously represent these inductions as propositions in its head. But animals use induction, okay? And that's how we come to have induction. Now, we have this remarkable capacity that we're able to form propositions. We're able to not just think about what's going on, but we're able to think about processes going on inside us, not just the processes going on outside of us. And so at some point, you get a system that is able to make generalizations and predictions about the future based on the past, and do so consciously. We're able to exploit the regularities that occur around us. Okay, that's where sort of the first glimpses, I think, of inference come from. And because we are symbolic creatures, because we have minds that are capable of reflecting on our own mental processes, and we're capable of forming propositions, and I think this is largely a linguistic phenomena, but not exclusively, we're able to use deduction. We're able to observe and become aware of the fact that everything is what it is and not some other thing. That's a feature of reality. Everything is what it is and not some other thing, right? The law of identity, right? Or the principle of non-contradiction, right? These are things that we can observe. They are nowhere contradicted, right? Any system, any system that operated on different assumptions other than the principle of the excluded middle, the principle of identity, the principle of non-contradiction, any system, any organism that operated on the assumption that those were not true wouldn't be in this world for very long. It would find itself bumping into things, mistaking itself for something else, mistaking other things for things that they're not. They would be rationally incontinent. I mean, organisms have to conform, at least to some degree, to the truths of the world that they find themselves in. And so it's not surprising, it's not a mystery that there exist systems that track reality. I mean, think of what a brain is. Think of what a brain is for. Why did brains evolve? Brains are tracking systems. They're guidance systems. They are map-making systems, right? Your mind makes a map of reality, okay? And it's constantly revising and updating that map on a day-to-day basis. And because of language, we're able to share what we know and communicate it to one another. So the existence of rationality, although it's a very, I mean, the story that I've outlined is just like a thumbnail sketch, and it's very, very, very thin. But I mean, that outline is not far out. It is consistent with everything that we know about organisms. And it's not just an account of how we reason, it's an account of how other organisms reason and how limited they are. I mean, the interesting thing about a naturalistic account of rationality of the sort that I'm outlining here is that it has really wide scope. Positing a God doesn't explain why we have the rationality that we do, why we have the inferential failures that we do, why our memories are as good as they are and why they fail in certain respects, why we're subject to certain perceptual illusions and not others, okay? But natural selection helps us understand exactly why our minds work the way they do, why we have the capacities that we do, and why we're subject to the limitations that we do and the failures that we do. Not only that, but a naturalistic account helps us understand, for instance, why other organisms very similar to us, such as chimps and gorillas and so, have a more rudimentary form of rationality. It's not a coincidence that they are also very smart, smarter than dogs, smarter than rats, but not as smart as us, right? Because of their relationship to us. And the more things are unrelated to us, the less smart they get. The certain kinds of cognitive capacities that they lack, until you get all the way down to microorganisms that have no minds. Are simple, unguided systems that simply react to the environment around them in a reflexive way. It explains why we have certain. A naturalistic account explains why we have reflexes that we share with other animals. Why we have certain emotional reflexes as well as physical action reflexes. Why we're subject to certain kinds of inferential failures. It explains why plants don't have minds and don't reason. Why are the garden flowers in my backyard, why are they not philosopher kings thinking up sophisticated theories? Why am I not even inclined to think that's the case? Because on a naturalistic evolutionary account, that would be gratuitous. Natural selection would not favor that. That would not be advantageous to a rooted plant, okay? But the God hypothesis predicts nothing. God could have just as easily created a world where the trees are deep metaphysicians. You know, the blades of grass could all be doing arithmetic for all we know, and that wouldn't be inconsistent with what a God could create if it was omnipotent. Okay. Positing an all-powerful God doesn't predict anything in particular about what we find about our mental life, why certain things have a mental life, why things don't have a mental life, why certain things that have a mental life have the mental capacities that they do, why they have the mental shortcomings that they do, why there's a similarity and gradient between us and chimps and old and new world monkeys and prosimians and ring-tailed lemurs and so forth, right? None of that is predicted or explained by positing a God. That is all a mystery, okay? No matter what the world looks like, it is going to be consistent with an omnipotent God, because a God that was omnipotent could create a reality that was vastly different from our own. And then the theist could still say, well, that's just how God wants it, right? This is a system of explanation that explains nothing. But our naturalistic evolutionary account gives us an account of why we have the rationality that we do. It explains how it could have come about. It explains the relationship in terms of similarity between us and other species, and why some organisms don't have minds at all. Right? That there's, if you want to demystify mental phenomena, you can do no better than evolutionary theory, it would seem. And it's not a coincidence that we have made the kinds of discoveries that we have, and that this particular theory explains better. It's because natural selection and evolutionary theory are theories that are born of looking at the world and studying organisms and studying their life histories and why they would have the guidance control systems that they do. But you know, Islamic theism and the Abrahamic faiths and those kinds of conceptions of God, they explain nothing. They just merely attribute the phenomena that needs explanation, a mental life, rationality, intentionality, and it just says they exist in a God, and God put those in the world. I can't think of a more vacuous explanation. That's just not an explanation at all.
Agreed. And that was a great sort of summary there. What you just explained, is that the same thing? Because I've heard you talk about this, something you called evolutionary reliability. Is that sort of what you've explained to some degree?
Well, I am an evolutionary reliabilist. That is, now I should say a little bit about that. I mean, obviously I believe in natural selection, and I believe in evolutionary theory, and I think that the complex adaptations that we find, and I think that our mental life is a product of that, is best explained in terms of things like natural selection. I think that our adaptive traits are not just, you know, coincidences or accidents. They are the products of natural selection, which is not accidental, but it is unguided. It is unintended. So what about the reliabilism? Well, there are in epistemology various theories or definitions of knowledge. One definition of knowledge is the JTB account, the justified true belief account. Knowledge, a person knows that something is true if that person has a belief that it's true. It is in fact the case that it's true, and the person is justified in believing that it's true. Okay, so you've got these three conditions. That's one definition of knowledge. It's Plato's definition of knowledge, derived from a dialogue called the Theaetetus. That's where the JTB account comes from. The justified true belief definition of knowledge comes from. But there are other definitions of knowledge that I think are better. Now, there are problems with the JTB definition of knowledge, and I mean, I won't get into those. But I mean, they're Gettier problems and so forth.
Yes.
But there are other definitions of knowledge on offer. The JTB just happens to be the first one that anyone studies because that's the first one anyone has ever come up with. That was Plato's theory. But a richer, I think, and more promising theory that gets around a lot of problems, but has problems of its own, but I don't think are insurmountable, is the reliable production theory. I think that I don't think that justification is part of the formal definition of knowledge. I think that knowledge needs to be understood not as JTB, but RTB, reliably produced true belief. I think that someone knows something when they have a belief that something is the case when it is the case. So the belief condition and the truth condition still hold for this account. But instead of a person having to be justified, it just has to be the case that the belief is reliably produced. Okay, so if you have a system on board that delivers reliable beliefs to you, if your beliefs arise not as a coincidence or chance or luck, but are reliably produced, right? If you have a belief-forming process, or an inferential process, or a perceptual process that yields reliable beliefs, or that is reliably true beliefs, then you know something when the belief is true, when you believe it, and it is reliably produced. So that's called the reliable production definition of knowledge. So I'm an evolutionary reliabilist. I think that evolution and natural selection helps us explain and understand why we have in our brains systems of reliable belief production. Think of what your brain is. Your brain is a system that systematically co-varies with changing states of affairs. So when I look over here, I don't see a hand, but when I look to my right, where my hand is raised, I suddenly see a hand, right? Visual perception is a system of reliable belief production. Your memory is a system of reliable belief production. Now, to say that something is reliable is not to say that it's perfectly reliable. That's why we have the qualifier perfect reliability. So if I say, oh, so-and-so is reliable, don't worry, he'll pick you up at that such and such a time. So-and-so is very reliable. Or so-and-so is probably telling you the truth. He's very, very reliable, right? When you're saying that someone or something is reliable, you're saying that, most of the time they're going to, deliver as they should according to some norm, but not that they will unfailingly always do so, that they're inerrant, for instance, right? And similarly, our visual system is reliable, and our olfactory system is reliable, and our memories are reliable, and our deductive capacities are reliable, and our inductive capacities are reliable, and so forth. These are reliable systems for arriving at true beliefs, but they're not inerrant. Right? Sometimes they fail us, and we're subject to certain systematic illusions, for instance, and certain systematic inferential errors. There's a vast literature on this, actually. And evolution doesn't just help us understand why we have the capacities that we do, but it helps us understand and predict why our minds fail us in the way they do quite systematically. So there are certain kind of predictable, irrational conclusions that we come to, for instance. And that is sort of well understood and best explained by evolutionary theory. So I'm an evolutionary reliabilist, and what that expression means is that I believe that our brains are guidance systems that track reality, that our brains are in the business of belief formation and belief production, belief rejection, and belief revision on an ongoing basis, and that this system was shaped by evolution through natural selection to produce reliable belief producing systems, such as our perceptual systems, our inferential practices, our memories, and so forth. So that's how I understand rationality. That would be a non-theistic account of how rationality came into the world. It evolved quite naturally. Some people will say, well, wait a minute, natural selection doesn't select for truth. Well, that's true. And actually he talks about that in his book, actually, and in that chapter. Natural selection doesn't select for truth.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Natural, and this is sort of Alvin Plantinga's objection against evolutionary naturalism. Natural selection doesn't select for truth. That's true. Natural selection is something that ensures that systems that enjoy better differential reproductive success will leave more surviving offspring. Okay. But now think about this. A system is not apt to leave more surviving offspring if it inveterately or invariably produces false beliefs, right? When it comes to true beliefs and a guidance system, okay, a map-making system, what we're interested in is veridicality. What we're interested in is accuracy. And accuracy is something that admits of degrees, right? There are some organisms that have better visual systems than us, right? An eagle or a hawk can spot things at distances and with an acuity that we could only imagine, that we could only dream of. You know, bees can see into the infrared, or rather the ultraviolet spectrum, right? You know, bats have echolocation; they have a kind of sonar, right? You know, different organisms have different perceptual apparatuses that reliably produce true beliefs. There's different ways of navigating. There's different ways of modeling what is happening in reality. Modeling reality, representing reality, is something that admits of degrees, okay? And that is exactly what natural selection can do, right? Natural selection isn't trying to give us true beliefs and doesn't select for true beliefs. It selects for fitness conferring behaviors, essentially, okay? But those fitness conferring behaviors are only going to be fitness conferring if they tend to conform to what is actually going on around you. There's no sense in chewing if there's no food in your mouth. There's no sense in the fornicating behaviors and actions if you're not with a mate. There's no sense in fleeing needlessly if you're not pursued by prey. And there's no sense in pursuing something that isn't your prey when you think it is your prey. You have to have reliable belief-forming processes if you're a mobile organism, right? You can't have invariably unreliable belief-forming processes. You wouldn't be around for very long. And so what happens is if a system has a belief-forming process that enjoys any degree of reliability, and there is a mutation that allows, you know, one of its offspring to make a slightly finer discrimination, track reality just a little bit better, then on average, which of those offspring in the next generation do you think are more likely to leave more surviving offspring, right? So it's absolutely true that natural selection doesn't select for truth. It selects for reliability. That's what it selects for. It selects for reliable belief forming processes, right? What we need are true indexical beliefs, true indexical representations. But we need our representations of what's going on around us to be as accurate as possible. The more accurate they are, the better we can exploit the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and the better we can avoid the dangers that surround us, okay? Natural selection cannot give you true beliefs, but what it can give you is reliable belief-forming processes, because it can select for the reliability of that system. And so I think that's how you get around the sort of the Alvin Plantinga's arguments against evolutionary naturalism, which is the sort of objection that I know that Tzortis is alluding to in that book.
Yes,
anyway,
indeed.
I hope that helps.
No, that was great. You probably know Scotsman Matt, I believe, and he's asking a question. Does reliabilism engage in circular reasoning, which begs the question that reliably produced beliefs can be present on atheism? This assumes the brain is the producer of beliefs. If Ozzy begged any more questions, he'd be in the Guinness Book of Records for doing so. Your response, sir.
Okay. Well, hello, Matt. I haven't talked to Matt in quite some time, actually. Matt and I used to cross paths quite a lot, and I used to enjoy a lot of philosophical and theological and apologetical discussions with him. So yeah, that's a good question, actually. Okay. I don't know about the charge of circularity, but I mean, there certainly is a question that needs to be asked here. I mean, about how do you establish the reliability of your senses, the reliability of your memory, the reliability of your inferential practices? Because after all, what are you going to use? You're going to use your mind. You're going to use those very processes. Okay. Well, that's absolutely true. We don't have a choice there. We are in fact going to use that. But I don't see how that's. I mean, that's exactly what I'm going to be using. Those are the processes I'm going to be using, no matter what account of how rationality arises, right? So this is the same objection that I would raise to Tzortis' objection earlier, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you posit a God, you're going to be exercising your cognitive capacities to evaluate that account. It just so happens that the account that we're evaluating is an account of our cognitive practices. With respect to, listen, you know, you're assuming physicalism and stuff like that. You're assuming some kind of mind-body identity such that brains cause minds. Well, I'm not just assuming that. There is evidence that brains cause minds. It's not conclusive, and it's not, and the evidence doesn't establish that that we will have a satisfactory account that allows us to reduce mental phenomena to physical phenomena. Okay, but we do know that that brains are associated with minds. We have no evidence of any minds where there are no brains. And the more sophisticated the brain, the more sophisticated the mind appears to be, based on just the behavioral richness and repertoire of the organisms in question. So is it possible that the blades of grass are in fact doing math, and that they're crying out in pain when I mow them? Of course, that's entirely possible, right? It is entirely possible that the entire universe is conscious. It is possible that every atom and electron possesses consciousness. That could be, but I have no reason to think that. And the phenomenon that I'm investigating is not the possibility of a mental life and rationality, but the actual phenomena that we find. I'm interested in how we have minds, how we're able to form beliefs, how we're able to reason, right? And I'm interested in how that came about. And I look at the world, I look at us, and we study psychology, we study physiology, we study neuroanatomy, we study evolutionary theory, we study the fossil record, we look at comparative anatomy between species and zoology, and all of these things. We take all of this into account. We're interested in studying not rationality in the abstract, right? But rationality as we actually find it. In other words, our conception of, like, what is rationality generally? You know, how is mind possible? I mean, those are good and important questions. But I mean, where to look for answers is actually looking at the systems that exhibit those properties of rationality and a mental life, right? And I'm not going to look to the blades of grass, and I'm not going to seriously entertain that that electrons are conscious until I have reason to think that they are conscious, that they have a mental life, and they exhibit rationality. So it's not, there's no sort of weird question begging circularity or arbitrariness in the account that I am favoring here. I am favoring the account that seems to be delivering us answers, because it's an account that is born of looking at the systems that exhibit the properties that motivate the inquiry in the first place. It is us and other organisms, and not certain other organisms and not certain other physical systems, like waterfalls, for instance. Waterfalls could be conscious. I don't think they are, right? The system, or rather the account that I am putting forward, that I favor here, is an account that is born of looking at systems that exhibit the properties that motivate the inquiry in general. So, have I ruled out, mind-body dualism? No, I haven't ruled it out. But I'm going with the account that seems to admit of certain kinds of answers. And I'm looking at the account that is sensitive to where the phenomena are in the first place. And the phenomena are in organisms that have brains. And that's where I'm looking. And if it turns out that ultimately the reason we're able to think is because we're made out of electrons, and electrons are conscious, and every electron is a little monad of consciousness. If that story turns out to be true, then I will update and revise my account. But I'm going with this account for the time being. And Matt, I hope I addressed the substance of your question there.
Great. Another question here from one of the guys actually that put me on to looking at you some months ago. Detector Inspector Monkfish asks, is the internalism, externalism distinction relevant when it comes to challenging evolutionary reliabilism on the grounds of not being able to guarantee true beliefs to be fitness enhancing? It's quite a mouthful.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, well, before I can address that, I have to explain for your listeners what internalism and externalism is. In epistemology, that is, within that branch of philosophy that concerns itself with questions of knowledge and justification and rationality and belief and truth and so forth, within epistemology, there are many theories of what constitutes justification. And theories of justification, that is, theories that explain what justifies a belief, what makes a belief justified or warranted. These theories can be broken down, broadly speaking, into two categories: internalist and externalist. And I won't get into specifics, but most people naively are internalists when it comes to justification. So if I say, what did you do yesterday? And you say, oh, I saw such and such, and I met so and so. And I said, really? Are you sure it was so and so? Because I thought so and so was dead. I heard he was dead. Are you sure? And you'd say, Now, when I'm asking, are you sure? What am I asking for? I'm asking for your justification. I want to know your reasons. Why do you think that you saw so-and-so? And you say, oh, well, I saw him with my own 2 eyes. He was right there. I talked to him. Oh, okay. Well, what are you relying on there? Well, you're relying on your perceptual capacities, your ability to recognize people. You're relying on your memory, your ability to recall what a person looks like and their name and their identity and so forth. You're appealing to certain reliable belief forming processes right there. But you're giving me your reasons. Okay. So now internalism is the view that justification, right, consists of the giving of reasons. If you ask me, Ozzy, how do you know such and such? And I say, well, I know such and such because of such and such. And I appeal to some memory I have, an experience that I had, a deduction that I performed, an induction that I performed, some kind of inferential practice or perceptual process or something like that. I'm appealing to some kind of cognitive act. Okay. So internalism is the view that in order for a belief to be justified, the agent who is justified has to be able to give reasons, and they have to be aware of their reasons. And even if they're not necessarily aware of it right now, they at least have to be able to recall it or summon it to consciousness. Okay, so the idea is that justification consists of the giving of reasons, the providing of reasons. Okay, and that's certainly true. We certainly do that. I mean, I think for pragmatic reasons, whenever we ask a person, how do you know that? Why do you think that's true? Or, how did you come to that belief? What we're doing there is we're asking for the person to provide us with reasons. I'm not persuaded. I'm not convinced. I need to hear your reasons, right? So we all do that, and I think that tugs us in the direction of what are called internalist theories of justification. A problem with the theory, with that theory, is that it seems to assume that in order to know something, you have to be able to give reasons, because that's what justification consists of. Okay, but then you can ask, but wait, how do you know that your reasons are true? Now you need to give me reasons to justify your reasons. Well, how do you know those reasons are true? Well, then you need to give me reasons for your reasons for your reasons. And that's how you get into this epistemic regress that presuppositionalists like to try to get people in. They try to appeal to our internalist intuitions and get us to believe that in order to know a proposition P, you have to know that you know that P, and you have to know that you know that you know that P, and you have to know, and so forth. And you get into this justificatory regress that never ends. There is another account of, or rather there are different accounts of justification that are called externalist. And an externalist conception of justification is one that says, look, giving reasons is important. It's necessary. It's necessary for pragmatic reasons, for the purposes of persuasion. It's necessary for for introspection, for the purposes of considering whether or not you should believe, and for the purposes of belief revision and evaluation. But really, that's not what justifies a belief. Okay, really, it's not the reasons that you can summon that justify a belief. Really, what justifies a belief is a state of affairs that obtains, a causal story that obtains between you and the belief. When I turn and I look and I see my hand, what is it the case? What makes it the case that my belief that this is a human hand in front of me is correct? What makes that belief true, right? What justifies my belief? Well, what makes the belief true is that there's a human hand here. But what justifies the belief? What justifies the belief is that there are photons bouncing off that hand, impinging on my sensory receptors, and that I have a brain capable of translating those signals into an experience of a moving hand with wiggling fingers right now, okay? In other words, there is a reliable process. There's a causal story between me and that belief, okay? There's a causal account between the state of affairs and the belief, such that it is the state of affairs that is causing the belief, right? If I turn my head and I say there is a human hand, but I'm just dreaming that there's a human hand there, okay? But there isn't a human hand there. I'm having the experience of there being a human hand, but there isn't a human hand there. So that's a false belief, right? It's true that I had the experience, but it's false that there is in fact a human hand there, because it's not the human hand that caused the belief. It was something purely neurological in my brain. When you go to sleep and you dream, I mean, why is the dream argument sort of a good skeptical scenario? Is because your brain is capable not only of delivering experiences reliably when you're awake, It's also capable of delivering false experiences when you're asleep. Your brain generates all of your experiences and is capable of doing that in the absence of the causes that would normally occasion those experiences, right? An externalist account is one that says, look, giving reasons is great, but really what ultimately justifies a belief is a causal story. It's a causal account of knowing, right? To be justified is to be in possession of a belief that was caused by the state of affairs that the belief is about, and that belief was produced by a reliable belief-forming mechanism. Okay, so my evolutionary reliabilism, for instance, is an externalist account of justification. It relies on an externalist account of justification. And the externalist account also explains why we give the reasons that we do. Like if you say, Ozzy, why do you think that there's a human hand next to you there? And because I can see it. I can feel it when I wiggle my fingers, and I can see it with my eyes. What am I appealing to there? What is my justification? I'm giving you reasons, but what is my what is the giving of reasons actually trying to do there? Is trying to capture the actual externalist causal story. That's the difference between internalism and externalism. An internalist account of justification is an account that seeks to explain justification in terms of the giving of reasons, that is all that justification consists of. An externalist is account of justification says that no, that's not actually what justification consists of. Justification consists of being in a certain causal relationship to the facts, having one's belief occasioned or caused by the state of affairs in a certain way, not any old way, but as a reliabilist, I would say, mediated by a process of belief formation that is reliable. Okay, so now I'm trying to figure what the question was again. Could you repeat?
Yes, of course. No, that was brilliant. Is the internalism, externalism distinction relevant when it comes to challenging evolutionary reliabilism on the grounds of not being able to guarantee true beliefs to be fitness enhancing?
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. So if you believe, as I do, that the possession of reliable belief-forming processes such as induction, deduction, abduction, visual perception, memory, and so forth, that those are the product of evolution, and I'm an externalist. Am I not guilty here of assuming that? Wait, hang on a second. I've lost sight of the question again. Forgive me. Could I ask you to read it again?
No problem. Is the internal externalism distinction relevant when it comes to challenging evolutionary reliabilism on the grounds of it not being able to guarantee true beliefs to be fitness enhancing?
Yeah. Okay. So the answer is yeah. It is relevant because there is no guaranteeing that my belief forming mechanisms are fitness enhancing. Right. I am in fact going to have to assume the reliability of my senses, and that my senses are made reliable by natural selection. Right. In the very act of establishing and defending the claim that that my cognitive systems are fitness enhancing. Right. I mean, the entirety of evolutionary theory is a product of this system, and if this system is just not reliable to begin with, right, then we're really screwed, aren't we? Right. So that's absolutely relevant. And actually, this brings to mind another concern that people have. A lot of people who, like presuppositionalists, for instance, or I'm sure Hamza Tzortis would try to argue, well, no, you need a God to get out of that problem. The problem with that is, though, presuppositionalists and people who posit that God is responsible for the reliability of our senses, our memory, and our rational confidence in induction, deduction, and our rational faculties. The difficulty there is that that's an externalist account too, right? Now, I think an externalist account is a better account than an internalist account, but But now think about this, right? I mean, if you're a presuppositionalist, okay, what is it that you think, right? About how do you account for rationality and the laws of logic, and how do you account for the reliability of our senses? How do you account for it? Well, what you say is this: there's this being, this God. He's all powerful, and he created us, and he created the world, and he created us for the world and the world for us, and he created us with minds capable of tracking reality and so forth, right? Such that we have reliable belief-forming processes. And he created us with belief-forming practices, not just perceptual practices, capacities, but also inferential capacities like induction and deduction. And he created an ordered world where the future will resemble the past, so that we can rely on induction and stuff. And hence, it's not a coincidence that our cognitive faculties are reliable. That's the story. That's the causal story that the theist wants to posit. Okay, to account for rationality, and the reliability of our senses and so forth, right? But that's an externalist account. What they are saying is that God is part of the causal story. God is the guarantor of our beliefs. God is what makes it possible for there to be knowledge. Okay, so the theist in this instance has a metaphysical picture. If my metaphysical picture is true, if things are thus and so, if there is a God and he created the world thus and so, and he created us for the world thus and so, he created an ordered regularity with the future will resemble the past, and he created us with perceptual capacities that allow us to apprehend what's going on around us and stuff, and he created us with reliable belief-forming processes, not perfect ones. We're still subject to inferential failures. We're still subject to illusions, but our minds are generally reliable and up to the task of tracking reality for the purposes of getting on in the world. Right? If that story is true, then I know what I think I know. That's not bad. I don't know how you establish that there's a God and all that, but that's okay. So it's not a perfect theory, but it makes sense. It's coherent. But I have a coherent theory too. It's all of that, leave God out of it and replace it with natural selection. There is an ordered reality. As a matter of brute fact, there is a cosmos, and it does follow established regularities, which will hold into the future. How do I know that's true? I don't know that's true any more than anybody knows that God exists and has the properties that he has and has the motives and intentions that he has. I just take it as a brute fact that this is how the world works. Okay? And natural selection it provides the best account that we have, empirically speaking, for why we have the brains that we do, the rational faculties that we do, why we have the belief-forming practices and systems on board that we do, okay? And that too explains why we can trust our senses, our memories, our inferential practices. Now, if that metaphysical story is true, well, then I know what I think I know, right? So we have two metaphysical stories here: a naturalistic, non-theistic, undirected story, and a theistic, supernatural, directed story. One of those metaphysical pictures is going to be false. Maybe they're both false, okay? But now, which one is right? How are we going to decide which externalist account is right? The theist's externalist account of knowledge and justification of knowledge, or the one that I gave? Well, unfortunately, all we have are the rational faculties that we have, however we got them. That's it. We just have to investigate. And when we investigate using the rational faculties that we have, I find that that there is a world, that there are ordered regularities. Will they continue to hold in the future? I don't know. I have no choice but to assume that they will. There's evidence of natural selection. There's evidence of evolution. This account explains the pattern of minds and the capacities that they have that we find. And that's why I'm going with that story. And that story not only fits the available facts, it doesn't posit anything that's more metaphysically extravagant than that the future will resemble the past, and that there are established regularities, right? That's it. It doesn't postulate anything extravagant. There are still plenty of remaining mysteries. How did the universe get here? I don't know. But if I posit a God, I still don't know how the universe got here. I can simply insist God poofed the universe into existence, but that's not an account either. That's not an explanation. The mysteries remain whether you posit a God or not. And so I just think that God is just sort of this metaphysically unnecessary fifth wheel that adds nothing to the explanation. And with respect to internalism and externalism in this context, it's kind of funny that that presuppositionalists who posit that a God is necessary to explain our capacity to know, our capacity to reason, our capacity to think, they will insist all of these things, and they will provide an externalist account of justification and say, well, I can't prove that there's a God, but a God is necessary, otherwise these things wouldn't be possible. It's interesting that those people who are externalists in the next breath will, when they're challenging you, yes, but Ozzy, how do you know that your evolutionary reliabilism account is true? Will always ask me, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know? And suddenly revert to an internalist conception of justification. And hence what we have here is an externalist, a person who favors an externalist conception of justification, insisting that everyone else apply, they're applying an externalist conception of justification for their own epistemology, but when they challenge you on yours, they insist that you abide by the strictures of an internalist conception of justification, where you endlessly have to give reasons. Well, look, and I can play that game too. If they want to insist on internalism, I'll insist on internalism. How do you know that God exists? How do you know that God has the powers, capacities that you do? How did you establish that? And so on and so forth. And they're not going to be able to answer those questions without availing themselves of the phenomena in question, namely that we have minds and rational faculties. And if they're allowed to use those in the act of presenting their theory, then so am I. Right? We're all in the same epistemological boat here. It doesn't matter if you're a theist or an atheist. And so I think positing a God doesn't actually help you out of that problem. Anyway, I hope I addressed the substance of that question as well. I'm a little leery that maybe I didn't, that I missed a point there, but.
No, I think you've I hope you have as well. And if Detective Inspector Monkfish is still listening, which I'm sure he is, you can certainly post something if something is still unclear for you. I'm very conscious of your time, and I value it, Ozzy. And you know, if you're able to continue for a short while longer, that would be great. If you do have to go, then I totally understand.
I do have to go shortly, but I'm happy to take one or two more questions. But I think I'm trying my wife's patience here. My laptop webcam has failed, and my wife has generously let me borrow hers, but she's sort of stuck right now without her computer. So that's sort of weighing on my conscience right now.
Fair enough. No, I appreciate it. Obviously appreciate your time greatly. I've got TJ Singh, who's a regular panelist with us, who'd like to ask a question. So TJ, if you can unmute and go ahead and ask Ozzy a question.
Yes, Ozzy, hi. My question for you was, what are your thoughts on, process philosophy and also panpsychism?
I don't know what process philosophy is. Could you explain that? Do you mean process theology or?
Yes, it's related to that, but basically the denial of substance, or the denial of matter as such, and I guess you could say equating reality with processes or with becoming.
Yeah, that's a sort of a metaphysical question I don't have a lot to say about. It's not a question that I've sort of seriously entertained, so I really don't have anything substantive to contribute to that. I'm sorry, this seems like a horrible dodge, but I really don't have any thoughts on it. I would be in the position of the student here, eager to hear what you have to say about it, and maybe I could reflect on it, but nothing there really to say with respect to process philosophy or process theology. With respect to panpsychism, I find it very unconvincing. I don't find that the reasons why people give for panpsychism to be good. Panpsychism, for anyone who isn't familiar, is the view that psyche, that mind is everywhere, that it permeates everything, that reality is mind-like, that people who are panpsychists are sometimes idealists, but not always. And I find that the impetus towards, or the attraction or the appeal for panpsychism stems from the mystery of the mind. We don't know how to reduce the mind to the physical, and honestly, I think the prospects are not very great that we will. I mean, I just don't think we've made a lot of progress in explaining how the physical produces the mental. I think we've done a fantastic job of establishing that they are connected intimately somehow, that you don't have one without the other. But how one results in the other, I think, remains completely mysterious. I think we've made virtually no progress on that. And I think that people despair at that lack of progress and are inclined to think that somehow mind goes all the way down. It's not a matter of the organization of matter. It's more fundamental to matter itself. And so that even, electrons have minds, and every particle in the universe may be a unit of consciousness, and that what we call our minds is actually a higher level phenomenon, an aggregate of all these lower level consciousnesses summed up, things like that. I think that is a view that is more born out of despair at the lack of progress that we have made in solving the mind-body problem. So that's my view on that. With respect to the first part, I'm not familiar enough with it to comment.
If I may,
Sure.
what do you think about Friedrich Nietzsche and his concept of will to power?
Okay, well, we're shifting gears there. It's a terrifying concept, Nietzsche's concept of will to power. The way that it's normally understood nowadays is that really there is nothing in the world but power. There are just organisms in the world that are just bumping around and trying to assert themselves, and that which we call truth, that which we call beauty, that which we call reason itself, is really the exercise of the will to power, the ability to simply impose one's will on the world. I think that's kind of I think it's true of some people. I think some people approach discourse and that way, and it gives them a very cynical view of reason and reasoning. A lot of people are sort of despair at how long arguments take to convince people and how resistant people can be to argument, and just unable to succumb to the force of reason, and I think a lot of people, as a result, just think that everything just boils down to power. That reason and logic is really kind of a fetish. It isn't that people's valorization of good reasoning and critical thinking and logic is really just another political ideology. It is just one group's way of imposing their will on other people. It's a way of invalidating other people and their efforts at expressing their will. And I find that very cynical, and I think it's false to fact. Does that address your question?
Yeah. I mean, yes, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was going to go ahead and say, does that, as Ozzy said, does that address the question? I want to get to one more question in the live chat, and then I do want to let Ozzy go. I'm just conscious of his time.
Yeah, no, no, I was just wondering, that's implausible as an internal aspect to all things. Could that be plausible to you in terms of internal dynamics?
You've gone very soft there, TJ. Just repeat your question. It's almost like you muted yourself. I could barely hear you.
Sorry about that. No, I was wondering about will to power be something that you could see as plausible as in terms of the internal dynamics of living things.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I was very once enamored of Schopenhauer's theory of the will. I don't know if you've ever read any Schopenhauer, but I mean, he had this idea of, he wrote a famous book called The Will and Representation, and he had this idea of the will. Everything is really an expression of the will to live. And that kind of dovetails fairly well with Nietzsche's ideas, actually. So I think it's internally consistent. I just think it's false to fact, but I mean, it's internally consistent. I mean, I think that is a cynical and way of looking at the world and discourse and human interaction. But I mean, it's not incoherent or inconsistent. But it's a dark vision that I don't favor. But I mean, I sort of by nature kind of optimistic and sanguine. So
thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, TJ. One more question in the chat, Ozzy, for yourself, and then I'll just get you to just do a conclusion, a sum up of what you thought of Hamza Tzortis' view. But one last question that might take you slightly off track a little bit. The question is, I'm interested in what Ozzy would think about whether rationality is compatible with atheism on the epiphenomenalist theory of mind, and whether the presuppositionalists apply in that case. I think you've muted yourself there.
Sorry, I have. Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts in that question. Okay, well, let me say a little bit about epiphenomenalism for your listeners who won't know what that is. Epiphenomenalism is the view that our mental experiences, our mental life, are not causal. They don't do anything, right? So, I mean, if I bump my elbow and it hurts, maybe the experience of hurting, that pain, is caused in my brain, but that pain, that experience, that first-person subjective experience, doesn't do anything, doesn't affect my behavior, because everything ultimately is caused at a lower level of description. Okay, so when I look and I see redness, the experience of redness doesn't change anything. Everything, I mean, there might be a bottom-up account, a physiological or neurological account of my having the experience of redness, but my disposition to behave in a certain way, either because I like red or dislike red, or it means stop and I hit the brakes, that is all determined at the level of the plumbing, at the level of the hardware. And so that my mental life is just, it's not causal. It doesn't do anything. It's epiphenomenal. It is peripheral and acausal. It's just like a side effect. It's not doing anything. Okay, it's like the fuzz on the peach or something like that. It's like imagining that when I think there are like little, imagine that there were like little sparks and flashes happening around my head when I'm thinking, but they don't actually cause or do anything else. They don't actually change my behavior or dispose me to behave, because whatever was causing those sparks and bubbles to happen around my head while I was thinking is actually causing me to do everything that I do and behave and stuff like that. That's epiphenomenalism. So epiphenomenalism is the view that your mental life is a product of the bottom up processes, but never contributes to later behavior, or there's no top-down causation. So, for instance, when I decide, here, let me give you an example here. When I decide to raise my arm goes up. Now, normally we think, well, why did your arm go up, Ozzy? Well, because I decided, I formed the intention. It was a mental event. I want to raise my arm. Raise your arm, Martin. Okay, Ozzy raised his arm. Okay, so there you go. I raised my arm. Normally we think that the intention, this weightless thought, caused my arm to move somehow. Okay, but an epiphenomenalist would say, no, that's not what happened. What happened was, when you decided to raise your arm and you had the experience called deciding to raise your arm, what really happened was this. There were secretions of acetylcholine at the axon end plates of the motor neurons coming out of the motor cortex, and they activated a long chain of action potentials down your motor cortex through some afferent fibers, and this caused a contraction of your muscles through the ratcheting effect of the myofilaments, and your arm went up. Right? There's a story to be told of my arm going up, and even of my deciding to raise my arm, purely at a neurophysiological level. And it would seem that an exhaustive understanding of how my arm went up obviates the need to invoke the decision, because even the deciding to raise my arm has a physiological description at a neuroanatomical level. And so perhaps, so the epiphenomenalist argues, the mind is not doing anything. Your brain just gives off thoughts, feelings, and experiences and decisions, but they don't do a thing. It's all independently determined at the bottom level, at the physiological level. So that's the epiphenomenalist view. And now I've lost track of what the question was again. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, of course, no problem. I'm interested in what Ozzy would think about whether rationality is compatible with atheism on the epiphenomenalist theory of mind, and whether the presuppositionalist criticisms apply in that case.
Yeah, so if atheism is true and epiphenomenalism is true, yeah, I mean, yeah, it could be true. Yeah, I mean, these seem to be live possibilities. It is. I don't think epiphenomenalism is true for some rather long arguments that I can't get into now. But I mean, I think epiphenomenalism is false. But if it is true, that would be completely consistent with the story that I told already. And so atheism and epiphenomenalism could be true. And a presuppositionalist could argue, look, why would natural selection produce, I mean, and this is actually an interesting objection. Why would natural selection produce a system that has a mental life when it could just as easily produce, at least it would seem, maybe it can't, but on the surface it seems possible, that is, it's logically coherent to posit that natural selection could generate a system that has the guidance system that we have and allow us to navigate in the world without a mental life. Isn't the having of a mental life, if epiphenomenalism is true, then isn't the having of a mental life completely gratuitous, right? And so why would natural selection produce this, right? Why can't it just produce a robot, a mindless, zombie, a philosophical zombie that walks and talks and passes the Turing test and looks just like I do, but the lights are not on, there's nothing going on, right? That's actually an interesting objection. It is unclear, and that's part of the mind-body problem though, it's unclear why consciousness would have evolved. What was being favored by natural selection? What exactly is consciousness? What does consciousness give us that a philosophical zombie wouldn't have, right? Why would natural selection favor that? And how did consciousness arise? And why would natural selection favor it over and above a system that was rambling around in the world without consciousness, but behaved in a way that was morpho-behaviorally indistinguishable from how we behave? I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question because we don't know what exactly constitutes consciousness and how consciousness is produced, and therefore it's not clear why natural selection would favor it over a system that was just epiphenomenal, that just where consciousness wasn't doing anything or where consciousness was absent at all. I hope I got to the substance of that question.
Great, thanks, Ozzy.
I don't know from me there.
That's okay. Thank you very much. So just to wrap up with then, can you give us your view then on whether stated that Hamza hasn't given, in your view, good reasons, but I wonder if you could sort of encapsulate your conclusion in terms of whether atheism can account for rationality and whether Islamic theism can account for it.
Well, I don't think that atheism can account for anything because it's not an account of anything. But I think atheists who have certain philosophical views on rationality can account for it. In other words, I think that one can be an atheist and have an account of rationality. I outlined one already. I think that one can have a picture of reality or a worldview that includes no God whatsoever and account for rationality. And I think that Hamza Tzortis' arguments in that chapter miss their mark. They falsely assume that every atheist is a metaphysical naturalist. They falsely assume that they're all mind-body monists and materialists and physicalists, and that's not true. And even the reasons for thinking that naturalism and materialistic monism or physicalism can't account for the mind are nowhere presented. He doesn't give any good reasons for why they couldn't account for rationality. And what's worse of all, perhaps, is that he has given us a completely vacuous account of rationality in terms of his God. So not only has he not shown that atheism is incompatible with an account of rationality, but he hasn't provided us an account even of how rationality can be accounted for in terms of theism. So that would be my summation of my assessment of that chapter.
Great. Ozzy, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. I could listen to you for 5 hours, and I think there's some other people that could easily as well. As I say, I'm very conscious of the time, and thank you very much for taking the time. Hopefully there might be another opportunity. I've got so many topics I could have asked you here. We've only touched on 1 or 2, and you've done an amazing job and done all the talking, which is really what I wanted. I want to listen to you. So to you, a huge thank you. Possibly consider coming on again at some point. You're not obligated in any way, but thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm very honored that you invited me, and I'm very grateful that you afforded me and indulged me to prattle on as long as I did. I know I can be very verbose. I appreciate everyone sort of that's taken the time to hear me out on these things, and I would be very happy to appear again sometime on this topic or another topic with or without other guests. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you indeed. Thank you, Ozzy. Thank you, TJ, for jumping in. Thank you to all the viewers in the chats and the questions. We'll be back again next Friday on an Islamic topic this time, and hopefully we'll have Ozzy on one of the broader topics again in the future. Thanks very much to everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.